third video on the wax passage from the second meditation. This is going to be the final video. This is going to conclude my consideration of the wax passage. In this consideration, I'm going to begin at the end of the page with, I must therefore admit that the nature of this piece of wax is in no way revealed by my imagination, but is perceived by the mind alone. I'm speaking of this particular piece of wax. The point is even clearer with regard to wax in general. Okay, let me pause here. So what's going on here? Well, so far we've seen, okay, he's rejected the senses, that I know the wax, that I know what the wax is through the senses and the imagination. And he thinks now he can see that it's perceived by the mind alone. But how do we perceive the wax by the mind alone, right? That's kind of weird. So we're going to want to think about that. And then he goes on, he says, in parentheses, I'm speaking of this particular piece of wax. This wax, the point is even clearer with regard to wax in general, or the kind wax, right? So this is sort of a little aside to the Aristotelians, right? Because the Aristotelians claim that we know what something is through having a general concept of the thing and giving a definition of it, right? Through defining it through what can be said of it, through secondary substances or secondary accidents. And Descartes says, look, I'm focusing on the primary substance, this particular piece of wax. But the point is even clearer with regard to secondary substances, with regard to the wax in general. So it's not important for my argument that I'm dealing with this particular piece of wax, even though I am analyzing my knowledge of this wax. I could be making the same point even more clearly with the universal wax, with wax in general, with the concept of wax, the secondary substance. But what is this wax, which I perceived by the mind alone? There it is again. We're perceiving the wax by the mind alone. What is it? What is this wax, which I perceive with the mind alone? It is, of course, the same wax, which I see, which I touch, which I picture in my imagination. See, touch, picture in my imagination. In short, the same wax, which I thought it to be from the start. And yet, and here's the point, the perception I have of it is a case not of vision or touch or imagination, nor has it ever been, despite previous appearances, but of purely mental scrutiny. And this can be imperfect and confused, as it was before, or clear and distinct, as it is now. So here we've got purely mental scrutiny, and it was imperfect and confused before, but now it's supposed to be clear and distinct. I mean, how is my perception of the wax gone from being imperfect and confused to being clear and distinct? How does that happen? Depending on how carefully I concentrate on what the wax consists in. What the wax consists in. We'll come back to this in a second. Let me scroll down for a second. There's this footnote here, right? So, and yet, and here's the point, the perception I have of it is a case, not of vision or touch or imagination, purely mental scrutiny. The perception which can be conceived only by the understanding or the mind, in the later French version, only by the understanding or the mind, right? So, okay, so what is this perception that can be conceived only by the understanding or the mind? Where is that? So going back up now, so we want to know, right, we've got, and here's the point, the perception I have of it, which can be conceived only by the understanding or the mind, is a case not of vision or touch or the imagination, nor has it ever been, despite previous appearances, but of purely mental scrutiny. So the kind of perception I have of it now can only be had by the understanding. So although it's I did not quite line this up. Let's move it. Here we are. That's where we were. Okay. So I can only have it, this special kind of perception, by the understanding. What is this perception that I can only have by the understanding that's perceived by the mind alone through purely mental scrutiny? I mean, it's the same wax. It's the same wax that I thought it to be before from the start, which I saw, which I touched, which I pictured in my imagination. And yet now I've got a kind of understanding of it that can only, I've got a kind of perception of it that can only be had by the understanding. And this perception I have only through the understanding seems to be clear and distinct, whereas before it was imperfect and confused. And somehow this perception that I have through the understanding, which is now clear and distinct, if I concentrate carefully on it, will tell me what the wax consists in, right? Or it'll answer my question, what is it? Right? I mean, what's the answer to the question, what is it? Well, it's whatever it consists in, right? So what the wax consists in is going to be an answer to the question, what is it? And that's going to be what I now perceive through the understanding, through the mind alone. Now, of course, it's the same wax that I was perceiving before through the senses, through what I see, through what I touch, the proper sensibles, or through the imagination, right? So it's the same thought as it was from the short. And yet now the perception I have of it is through the understanding, through mental scrutiny. I've cut away all of the parts of my perception of the wax that came from the proper sensibles through the five senses or through the imagination, the common sensibles. And I've isolated out from that imperfect, confused idea of the wax, what the wax consists in, what its nature is, and that perception of the wax is clear and distinct. And it's that clear perception of the wax, of what the wax consists in, separated off from what I see, touch, or imagine, that is my standard, that is my measure of when I have the same wax again, right? So it's this idea of the wax that I have in the understanding that tells me what is the same wax again. Okay, Descartes fills all this out further in the next paragraph. So he says, but as I reach this conclusion, I'm amazed at how weak and prone to error my mind is. For although I'm speaking about these matters within myself, silently and without speaking, nonetheless, the actual words bring me up short, and I'm almost tricked by ordinary ways of talking. How is he almost tricked by ordinary ways of talking? How did the words bring him up short? What does he mean by that? Well, we say that we see the wax itself. It is there before us, not that we judge it to be there, from its color or shape. Color or shape. And this might lead me to conclude, without more ado, that knowledge of the wax comes from what the eye sees, and not from the mental scrutiny, from the scrutiny of the mind alone. But then, if I look out the window and see men crossing the square, as I just happened to have done, I normally say that I see the men themselves, just as I say that I see the wax. Yet, do I see any more than hats and coats, which could conceal automatons? So automatons are robots, right? So they're automatons. A maton is a moving thing in Latin, and an automaton is a self-moving thing. And so a self-moving thing is a machine, like a robot. So, yet do I see any more than hats and coats, which could conceal automatons, robots? I judge that they are men. And so something which I thought I was seeing with my eyes is in fact grasped solely by the faculty of judgment, which is in my mind. Okay, well, what's going on here? What's going on here? Well, Descartes is worried about being tricked by ordinary ways of speaking, right? That's where he starts off, right? This tendency he has to be tricked by ordinary ways of talking. Well, how might he be tricked? What's he worried about? Well, we say we see the wax itself, if it is there before us. Not that we judge it to be there from its color or its shape. Or that might lead us to think, so the way we might be tricked is that the wax comes from what the eye sees, right? That it's through the eyes that I take the wax itself to be there, right? And not from judgment. We judge it to be there, right? And so notice, I mean, here Descartes has in mind the old Aristotelian way of thinking, right? I mean, the ordinary ways of talking that I see the wax, they back up the Aristotelian ways of thinking about knowledge. So think back to the three objects of sense: proper, common, and incidental. So when I see this piece of wax, not only do I take in its color, a proper sensible, or its shape, a common sensible, two accidents, right? So proper and common, those were accidents. So not only do I take in sensible forms of these proper and common objects of sense, these two accidents of the wax, but I also take in an incidental form from the incidental object of sense, the wax itself, which is a substance. And so on the traditional Aristotelian way of thinking, I do see the wax itself, the incidental object of sense, the substance, in which the proper and common sensibles are present, right? So the color, the shape is present in, remember, it's present in the incidental object of sense. And so in seeing the wax, not only do I take in a sensible species of the color and of the shape, but I also take in a sensible species of the incidental object, the substance, the wax. But Descartes thinks, well, hold on a minute. That's not how this really works. I don't see the wax itself, right? I'm not seeing the wax itself, Rather, I'm just seeing the color and the shape. I'm just seeing the proper and common sensibles. I'm just seeing these accidents of the wax. I'm not seeing the substance directly. I'm seeing the accidents. Rather, to get from the accidents, the proper and common sensibles, the shape and color, right? I need to make a judgment. So we may say that we see the wax itself if it's there before us, not that we judge it to be there from its color or shape. And this might lead me to conclude without more ado that knowledge of the wax comes from what the eye sees and not from the mental scrutiny of the mind alone, from the judgment that I make on the basis of the color and the shape about the wax as being there. Okay, he clarifies this with an analogy, right? So what's the analogy? Well, he says, there are these men out in the square, and all that he sees of the men are the hats and the coats. But he judges that there are men there, not automatons, right? So he makes a judgment about the substance, that there are men, in virtue of seeing the hats and the coats. So what's the analogy? You might want to pause the video, take a second to think about it. The analogy is between the men on the one hand and what? The wax, right? And the hats and the coats and the proper and common sensibles. Right, and so I look out the square and I see the hats and the coats and I judge that there are men there. Similarly, I look at the wax and I take in its color and its shape and I judge that it's this piece of wax. And so that's the analogy of the hats and the coats. And the thing that Descartes wants to ward off is this thought that I'm taking in an incidental objective sense. And that incidental objective sense is a sensible form of the substance. And that's how I know the wax, right? That's the Aristotelian view that he thinks is absolutely wrong. So on the Aristotelian account, where we have these three objects of sense, we know the wax first through taking in that incidental form, the form of the wax. And Descartes thinks, no, we don't take in an incidental form of the wax. There is no incidental sensible species through which we know the wax first. Rather, we get to our knowledge of this piece of wax through a judgment on the basis of the proper and common sensibles, through the basis of the color, the shape, these accidents, the knowledge we get of these accidents. But it takes a judgment to get from those accidents in the senses and the imagination to the wax itself. And notice, I mean, the wax, really what it is, I mean, so what is it? I mean, how is Descartes going to answer what is it in relation to this wax? Well, he's going to say it's this extended thing. So remember, for Descartes, all of extension, all of physical space is full, it's filled. And every part of it has the same nature as every other part of it, right? It's completely uniform. I mean, the laws of nature are uniform, right? So the laws of physical space are uniform. And so this wax, what is it? Well, it's an extended thing. It fills up this part of physical space. Now, how do I recognize this wax as the same wax after it melts when I set it by the fire? Well, I have an idea of what it is as an extended thing because I have an innate idea of extension. And that innate idea of extension is what lets me recognize the same extended thing across all of its changes in its outward modes, right? Because I recognize what the thing is, what its essence is, what it consists in. And so because I have the innate idea of extension, I can use it in relation to this extended thing, this piece of wax, and recognize it as the same piece of wax throughout the changes in all of its modes, in all of its accidental features. And so it's my idea of extension that has to be there obscurely. That's what lets me recognize the same extended thing again, just as Plato thought it was the form of the equal that let me recognize this instance of equality, that instance of equality, and another instance of equality, right? So it's the form of the equal being compared to these equal sticks, right? I see the equal sticks. The form of equality is stirred up in my mind. I recollect the form of equality. I compare that form of equality to what I'm now seeing, and I judge for Plato that these sticks are equal. Similarly, for Descartes, I see the wax, I see the hardness, I see the color, I see the shape, right? So I see this color, I see this shape that reminds me of the modes of extension, right? Color and shape are modes of extended things. And so that stirs up this innate idea of extension in my mind, this form of extension. And I recognize that this color, this shape, this taste, this smell, they all belong to the same extended thing. And so I judge that this extended thing is the same as that when I bring it close to the fire and it melts, right? So it's through this innate idea of extension that I recognize the same extended thing again, just as with the innate idea of equality, it's through the innate idea of equality that I recognize the same equality again, that I recognize the same property of equality again when I see, say, two equal glasses of water, right? So both Plato and Descartes thinks we have these innate ideas, and it's through being reminded of the innate ideas through what we take in through the senses that we're then, through the innate idea, able to judge about the thing in question. On Descartes' account, there's going to be many fewer of these innate ideas, so he doesn't go in for the forms in quite the way that Plato does. He only thinks we've got a few of these innate ideas. One of them is this innate idea of extension and extended things. Another is an innate idea of ourselves as a thinking thing. And we'll see in the next meditation that we have an innate idea of God. And in general, he thinks geometry is the study of the innate idea of extension, but there's only going to be a few of these innate ideas, many fewer than what Plato thought, but the account of judgment is very similar, right? In both cases, we've got a kind of standard that is what allows us to recognize what we're taking in through the senses as the thing that it is, right? So in both cases, there's a form or an innate idea that acts as a standard that lets us make the judgment in question. So Descartes clarifies this a little further. He develops this a little bit further if we go down on the page. So let me erase what I've got here and then move down a little bit further. So hold on a second. Okay, so he goes on, he says, however, one who wants to achieve knowledge above the ordinary level, right? So who wants to have more knowledge than, when we take ourselves to see the substance, see the wax, right, in the way the Aristotelians do. So one who wants to achieve knowledge above the ordinary level, i.e. scientific knowledge, which is what we want, right? We want to be able to found a metaphysics and secure scientific knowledge. One who wants to achieve knowledge above the ordinary level should feel ashamed at having taken ordinary ways of talking as a basis for doubt, right? As the Aristotelian did. So let us proceed and consider on which occasion my perception of the nature of the wax was more perfect and evident. Was it when I first looked at it and believed I knew it by my external senses, or at least by what they call the common sense, that is the power of imagination? Or is my knowledge more perfect now, after a more careful investigation of the nature of the wax, of the means by which it is known? The nature of the wax, the what is it, right? Any doubt on this issue would be clearly foolish. And the means by which it is known. What's the means by which it is known? Well, that was that innate idea of extension. Right. That's how I know what the wax consists in, what its nature is. Any doubt on this issue would be foolish, for what distinctness was there in my earlier perception? Was there anything in it which an animal could not possess? But when I distinguish the wax from its outward forms, take the clothes off, as it were, and consider it naked, then although my judgment may still contain errors, at least my perception now requires a human mind. So what's going on here? Well, let's begin at the end, right? I mean, he's taking the clothes off, right? He's referring here back to the analogy of the last paragraph, the men in the square in their hats and coats, right? The hats and the coats were the clothes that they were wearing. And he's making the analogy explicit, right? So he's saying, well, what's the clothes of the wax? Well, it's the proper and common sensibles, right? Those are what the clothes are, what the hats and the coats are. And if I take the clothes off and consider the wax naked, well, what is that? Well, that's considering what the wax is, what its essence is, what the wax behind its outward forms that I can take in through the senses, right? So the outward forms are the proper and common sensibles, but when I consider it in itself naked, that's what the substance, the wax, is itself. And to get to that substance, the wax itself, that requires judgment. That requires an intellect, reason, the faculty for judgment, the faculty for taking things to be true or false. Remember, a judgment, it's through judgments that we form beliefs. It's through judgments that we take things to be true or false. And animals, Descartes thinks, don't possess that faculty. So they can take in the proper and common sensibles. They can take in the color and the shape. They have senses and imagination, but they only can know the accidents of things. They can't answer the question, what is it? So they can't know the essences of things. They can't know the essence of the wax because they can't make that judgment. They can't get past the proper and common sensibles, the colors, the shapes, to what the thing itself is, the wax itself. That requires judgment. And so before, when I first looked at my idea of wax, I thought I knew it by my external senses, or at least what I called the common sense or the imagination, at least by its shape and the changes that it could undergo. Right? So before, my idea of the wax was mixed together. My idea of what the wax is, of its essence, was mixed together. My idea of it as a body was mixed together with the ideas that I formed of it through the senses or the imagination. Right? So it was confused, it was compounded, it was obscure, my older idea of body. But now I've cut away those ideas that I get from the common sense and those ideas that I get through the senses, and I've isolated just that standard, that idea of body, of what the wax consists in, of what it is on its own, without any admixture of the ideas that I form through the senses and the imagination. And it's that idea of the wax as a body, that standard by which I measure when I encounter the same extended thing again, that I've now isolated. And so that's what I have now, after a more careful investigation of the nature of the wax, of what it is, and by means of which it's known through that innate idea of extension. And so now I have this clearer, more distinct perception of the wax that I could only arrive at through judgment, which required a human mind and which animals don't possess. And so Descartes thinks, I now know the wax better than I did before because I've cut away those extraneous elements of my knowledge of the wax, what I get through the senses and the imagination, that don't tell me what the wax is, what its essence is, that aren't the standard by which I recognize the same extended thing again.